The biblical world's diet, what was truly on the table 2,000 years ago? That was the question that consumed Professor Daniel Whitfield's every waking thought as he stood alone in his cramped office at Boston University on a cold February evening in 2019. The fluorescent light above his desk flickered intermittently, casting uneasy shadows across stacks of ancient texts, yellowed research papers, and half-empty coffee cups that told the story of a man who had forgotten how to take care of himself. Daniel was 53 years old, with deep-set hazel eyes framed by round wire-rimmed glasses, a salt and pepper beard that had grown unruly over the past several months, and a slight stoop to his shoulders that spoke of decades hunched over manuscripts and archaeological reports. He had spent the better part of 30 years studying the intersection of ancient food systems and biblical civilizations, and yet, on this particular evening, he felt as though he had barely scratched the surface of something enormous, something that most of the modern world had gotten entirely wrong. Daniel Whitfield had not always been an isolated academic buried in dusty archives. There had been a time, not so many years ago, when his life had been full in the way that most people would consider meaningful. He had been married to a woman named Catherine, a pediatric nurse with warm brown eyes and a laugh that could fill an entire room. They had raised a daughter together, Elise, who was now 24 and living in Chicago, working as a junior editor at a small publishing house. But that life, the one with Sunday morning pancakes and evening walks along the Charles River, had quietly dissolved over the course of several painful years. Catherine had left him in the spring of 2017, not because she had stopped loving him, but because she said she could no longer compete with the ghosts of ancient civilizations for his attention. Daniel had not argued. He had simply watched her pack her things and walk out the front door of their Brookline apartment, and then he had returned to his desk and continued working on a paper about grain cultivation in first-century Galilee as though nothing had happened. That was the thing about Daniel Whitfield. He understood the dietary habits of people who had lived 2,000 years ago better than he understood the emotional needs of the living, breathing woman who had shared his bed for 26 years. The question that had consumed him most recently was deceptively simple but staggeringly complex in its implications. What did people actually eat during the time of the Bible? Not the sanitized, symbolic version that appeared in religious paintings and Hollywood films, where Jesus and his disciples sat around a pristine table with perfectly formed loaves of bread and goblets of deep red wine. No. Daniel wanted to know the raw, unvarnished, historically accurate truth. What were the textures, the flavors, the smells? What did a common family in Jerusalem or Nazareth or Capernaum actually put on their table on an ordinary Tuesday evening 2 millennia ago? And more importantly, why had the modern world so thoroughly distorted and romanticized the reality of what that ancient diet looked like? He had been wrestling with these questions for years, but it was a specific discovery that had recently reignited his obsession with new intensity. 3 months earlier, in November 2018, a colleague named Dr. Sarah Chen, an archaeobotanist at the University of Pennsylvania, had sent him a package containing detailed analysis of carbonized food remains recovered from a recently excavated domestic structure near the ancient site of Magdala, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. The findings were remarkable. Among the charred remnants were traces of emmer wheat, hulled barley, lentils, dried figs, and what appeared to be the residue of fermented fish sauce, a condiment that most people associated with Roman cuisine, but that had evidently been a staple in the households of Jewish families living in the Galilee region during the 1st century. The discovery challenged several long-held assumptions about the diet of common people in biblical times, and Daniel knew immediately that he was looking at something that could reshape public understanding of the ancient world. But there was a problem. Daniel had recently been denied funding for a major research project that would have allowed him to travel to Israel, collaborate with archaeologists on the ground, and produce a comprehensive study that combined archaeological evidence, textual analysis of biblical and rabbinic sources, and experimental recreation of ancient recipes. The university's research committee, led by a man named Dr. Wei, Richard Harlow, the department chair, had deemed Daniel's proposal too narrow in scope and unlikely to generate the kind of public interest that justified the expenditure. The rejection had stung deeply, not because Daniel cared about money or prestige, but because he genuinely believed that this research mattered, that understanding what people ate 2,000 years ago could illuminate something profound about human civilization, about community, about the spiritual dimensions of gathering around a table to share food. He sat at his desk that February evening, staring at the denial letter for perhaps the 100th time, when his phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter Elise. It read simply, "Dad, call me when you get a chance. Something's come up." Daniel looked at the message for a long moment, then set the phone face down on his desk and returned to his notes. He would call her later, he told himself. He always told himself that. What Daniel did not know,
and
as he sat alone in his office surrounded by the remnants of ancient meals and modern failures, was that the next 6 months of his life were about to unfold in ways he could never have predicted. A chance encounter with a young graduate student, a controversial public lecture, a painful reckoning with his own family, and an extraordinary culinary experiment that would ultimately bring together everything he had been working toward for 3 decades, were all converging on the horizon.
It is not just sustenance.
The biblical world's diet, what was truly on the table 2,000 years ago, was about to become far more than an academic question. It was about to become the lens through which Daniel Whitfield would finally learn to see the people in front of him.
The ingenuity of our ancestors
with the same depth and reverence he had always reserved for the dead.
Consider the simple elegance of this
Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui você descobre histórias reais que mudam a forma como você enxerga o mundo. E essa é apenas o começo de uma jornada que vai te surpreender do início ao fim. 3 days after staring at that rejection letter, Daniel was standing in front of a lecture hall filled with approximately 120 undergraduate students,
it is the
delivering
most
his
beautiful
regular
deception.
Tuesday
It is
morning
not about
class on
particles
ancient
communicating,
Mediterranean
it's about
food
particles
systems.
existing as one.
The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and
Here,
wet winter
look
coats,
at this.
and the students, most of whom were taking the
is
course to
this?
fulfill a humanities
I
requirement,
recognize this.
stared at him with varying degrees of attention and indifference.
I understand why you're here.
Daniel had long since made
Let me
peace
tell
with
you
the
what I've
fact that
learned.
most of his students did
Tell
not
me.
share his passion for the subject. He did
The
not take it
data
personally. He
unequivocally
simply
supports
taught with the
my
same meticulous
hypothesis.
rigor
Yes,
he
I'm
applied to
starting to see
everything
your
else,
point.
trusting that at least a handful of attentive minds would absorb something meaningful. On this particular morning, he was lecturing about bread, the
Bread,
single most important food
olive
in the
oil,
biblical world.
Wine,
He paced
legumes,
slowly at the front of
and
the room,
vegetables.
speaking without
That's
notes,
all there was.
his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent a lifetime with the material. Bread in the ancient
argument
world,
here
he
has a
explained,
fundamental flaw.
was nothing like the soft, pillowy, uniformly shaped
Your
loaves
work is
that line
all
the
here,
shelves of modern American
but it
supermarkets.
has to connect with this.
The
It's
bread of
missing
first-century
heart.
Palestine was dense, flat, coarse, and often gritty with small fragments of stone that had been ground into the flour during the milling process. It was made primarily from emmer wheat or barley, 2 grains that were central to the agricultural economy of the region, and it was baked in small clay ovens called taboons that stood in the courtyards of most households. The bread was torn by hand, never sliced, and it served not merely as food, but as a utensil, used to scoop up stews, dip into olive oil, and wrap around pieces of roasted fish or salted cheese. In the biblical world, bread was life itself. It was the foundation of every meal, the basis of every offering, the metaphor around which an entire spiritual tradition was constructed. He paused and looked out at the sea of faces. A few students were typing notes on their laptops. Several were surreptitiously scrolling through their phones. One young man in the back row appeared to be asleep, but in the third row, slightly off-center, a young woman was watching him with an expression of such focused attention that it momentarily disrupted his train of thought. She had dark, curly hair pulled back in a loose bun, olive-toned skin, and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to be actively processing everything he said. He did not recognize her. She was not one of his regular students. After the lecture, as students filed out of the room in a noisy stream, the young woman approached him. She introduced herself as Maya Reyes, a first-year graduate student in the gastronomy program at Boston University's Metropolitan College. She was 27 years old, originally from San Antonio, Texas, and she had an undergraduate degree in anthropology from UT Austin. She explained that she had been auditing his lecture for the past 3 weeks because her thesis advisor, a woman named Dr. Lisa Fontaine, had suggested that Daniel's expertise could inform her research on the historical roots of communal eating practices. Maya spoke quickly and with an energy that Daniel found both refreshing and slightly exhausting. She had a habit of asking 3 questions in rapid succession before giving anyone a chance to answer the first one. What struck Daniel most, however, was the nature of her first substantive question. She asked him, with a directness that bordered on blunt, why he thought so many modern interpretations of biblical food were wrong.
It's a game changer.
Daniel studied her for a moment, then set his briefcase down on the lectern and said that the answer was complicated, but could be summarized in one word:
and we have the
projection.
team and technology to make it happen.
Modern people, he explained, almost invariably projected their own cultural assumptions about food onto the ancient world. They imagined that the meals described in the Bible resembled the food they themselves were familiar with, simply dressed in ancient clothing. They pictured leavened bread when most daily bread was unleavened.
It's right here.
They imagined large cuts of roasted meat when, in reality, meat was a rare luxury consumed only on special occasions, festivals, and sacrificial rituals. They envisioned tables laden with variety, when the truth was that the diet of most common people in biblical Palestine was remarkably limited,
And this is
centered
Maya,
on
our new
bread,
strategist.
olive oil,
great to be
wine,
here.
legumes,
Welcome aboard.
seasonal vegetables, and whatever fruit happened to be in harvest. The famous land of milk and honey was, for most of its inhabitants, a land of bread and lentils and hard work. Maya listened to all of this with her arms crossed, nodding slowly, and then she said something that stopped Daniel in his tracks. She told him that she had read his 2015 paper on fermented foods in the ancient Levant, and that while she found his scholarship impeccable, she thought he was missing something crucial. She said that his work treated ancient food as an artifact, something to be analyzed and categorized, but that he rarely addressed food as a living experience, as something that connected people emotionally, socially, and spiritually in ways that went beyond mere nutrition. She said that if he wanted people to truly understand what was on the table 2,000 years ago, he needed to make them feel it, not just know it. Daniel was not accustomed to being critiqued by first-year graduate students, but something about Maya's observation struck him as uncomfortably accurate. He had spent so many years analyzing ancient food from a distance, measuring grain particles under microscopes and cross-referencing rabbinic texts, that he had perhaps lost sight of the fundamental human experience at the center of it all. The experience of sitting down with the people you loved, breaking bread together, and sharing in the simple, sustaining act of eating. He thanked Maya for her feedback in a tone that was polite but guarded, gathered his things, and left the lecture hall. But her words followed him through the rest of the day and into the evening, where he sat alone in his apartment eating reheated Chinese takeout from a cardboard container while staring at a stack of archaeological reports.
Yes, that makes sense.
The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the communal meals of the ancient world, eating alone out of a box.
Substance all at once.
That same evening, Elise called again. This time, Daniel answered. His daughter's voice was tight with a mixture of anxiety and forced cheerfulness that he recognized immediately as a sign that something was wrong. She told him that she had been experiencing persistent abdominal pain for the past several weeks, and that her doctor had ordered a series of tests. She said it was probably nothing, just stress or a food sensitivity, but she wanted him to know. Daniel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He asked her if she needed him to come to Chicago, and she laughed lightly and said no, that she was fine, that he should focus on his work. The ease with which she dismissed his offer told him everything he needed to know about the kind of father he had been. His daughter did not expect him to show up because he never had. The following week, Daniel received an unexpected email. It was from a producer at a Boston-based media company called Meridian Content, a firm that specialized in educational documentary content for streaming platforms and YouTube channels. The producer, a man named Jack Nolan, explained that he had come across several of Daniel's published papers and found the subject matter fascinating. He was developing a series of short documentary episodes about the real history behind commonly held beliefs, and he wanted to dedicate an episode to the diet of the biblical world. He asked Daniel if he would be willing to serve as the lead expert for the project and, more importantly, if he would be open to participating in a hands-on experiment, actually recreating authentic first-century meals using only historically accurate ingredients and methods. Daniel read the email twice, then 3 times. His first instinct was to decline. He was a serious academic, not a television personality, and he had always been skeptical of the way popular media handled historical subjects. But then he thought about Maya's critique. about the gap between knowing and feeling, about the distance between analyzing ancient bread under a microscope and actually baking it in a clay oven with your own hands. And he thought about the research funding he had been denied, and how this project might accomplish through a different avenue what the university had refused to support. He responded to Jack Nolan with a cautious expression of interest, and 3 days later, they met for coffee at a small cafe near Copley Square. Jack was in his mid-30s, lean and sharp-featured, with the restless energy of someone who lived on caffeine and deadlines. He laid out his vision for the episode with infectious enthusiasm. He wanted to show audiences what a real meal in biblical times looked and tasted like, not through animation or reenactment, but through an actual cooking experiment conducted by a credible historian. He wanted texture, authenticity, and emotional resonance. He wanted viewers to watch the episode and feel as though they had been transported 2,000 years into the past and seated at a table they never knew existed. Daniel found himself unexpectedly drawn in. He agreed to participate, but on one condition. Every historical claim made in the episode had to be rigorously sourced and defensible. Jack agreed without hesitation. And just like that, Daniel Whitfield, the solitary academic who had spent 3 decades studying ancient food from behind a desk, was about to step into the living, breathing, deeply human world of actually making it. The preparation for the documentary project consumed the next several weeks of Daniel's life in a way that nothing had in years. He found himself working with a renewed sense of purpose, not just compiling data and citations, but thinking deeply about how to translate decades of scholarship into something visceral and immediate. Jack Nolan had assembled a small but capable production team, including a cinematographer named Luis Garza, a sound engineer, and, at Daniel's suggestion, Maya Reyes, who had eagerly volunteered to assist with the historical research and recipe development when Daniel mentioned the project during one of their increasingly frequent conversations after his lectures.
Foods, gut health.
The first major task was to compile a definitive list of the foods that would have constituted the core diet of a typical household in first-century Palestine. Daniel approached this with the methodical precision that characterized all of his work, cross-referencing archaeological evidence from excavated domestic sites, agricultural data from the region, and textual sources including the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the Mishnah, and the writings of first-century historians such as Josephus and Pliny the Elder. What emerged was a picture of a diet that was simultaneously simpler and more sophisticated than most modern people imagined. The foundation of everything was grain. Wheat and barley were the 2 dominant crops of the region, and they appeared in virtually every meal in some form. Wheat, particularly emmer wheat and the somewhat more refined bread wheat that was becoming more common by the 1st century, was the preferred grain for bread, but it was more expensive and therefore more often consumed by wealthier households or on special occasions. Barley, which was hardier, grew more readily in the region's rocky and semi-arid terrain and was significantly cheaper, was the everyday grain of the poor. The bread made from barley was darker, denser, and less palatable than wheat bread, and it carried a social stigma that is difficult for modern people to appreciate. In the biblical world, the type of bread you ate was a direct marker of your social and economic status. When the Gospel of John describes Jesus feeding the 5,000 with barley loaves, the detail is not incidental. It is a deliberate signal that this miracle was performed for and among the poor. Beyond bread, olive oil was arguably the most important single food product in the ancient diet. Olives and olive oil permeated every aspect of daily life. Oil was used for cooking, for preserving food, for lighting lamps, for anointing the body, for medicinal purposes, and as a key ingredient in religious rituals. The olive groves that dotted the hillsides of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee were among the most valuable agricultural assets a family could possess, and the annual olive harvest in the autumn was one of the defining rhythms of the agrarian year. Daniel explained to Maya during one of their long research sessions in his office that to understand the biblical world, you had to understand that olive oil was not merely a cooking ingredient. It was a currency, a technology, and a sacred substance all at once. Wine was the 3rd pillar. The people of biblical Palestine drank wine regularly, not as a luxury, but as a basic dietary staple, much as modern people might drink water or coffee. The wine of the ancient world was typically diluted with water, often at a ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine, and it was consumed at virtually every meal. Undiluted wine was considered barbaric, a practice associated with excess and moral degradation. The wine was stored in large clay jars or in goatskin bags, and it varied considerably in quality depending on the vineyard, the vintage, and the skill of the winemaker. It is worth noting, Daniel told Maya, that the famous miracle at the wedding in Cana, where water is transformed into wine, would have carried enormous practical significance for the original audience. Running out of wine at a wedding was not merely an inconvenience. It was a social catastrophe, a humiliation that could damage a family's reputation for years. The fourth major category was legumes, particularly lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans. These were the protein workhorses of the ancient diet, especially for families who could not afford meat. Lentils were cooked into thick stews and porridges that were eaten daily, often flavored with garlic, cumin, coriander, and other locally available spices. The famous biblical story of Esau selling his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew speaks to the centrality of this humble dish in the dietary landscape. It was comfort food in the most fundamental sense, the meal that sustained you when there was nothing else. Fish constituted the fifth major food group, particularly for communities living near the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, or the Mediterranean coast. The fishing industry around the Sea of Galilee was substantial and well organized, and fish was consumed fresh, dried, salted, and fermented into a pungent sauce that the Romans called garum, and that appears to have been widely used throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The most common species were tilapia, sardines, and a type of catfish. Daniel emphasized that while Jesus' disciples were famously fishermen, and fish appears frequently in the New Testament narratives, it is important to remember that for inland communities far from bodies of water, fresh fish was a rarity. Most people in the Judean hills, for instance, would have consumed fish primarily in its preserved forms. Fruits and vegetables formed the sixth category. Figs, dates, grapes, and pomegranates were the dominant fruits, each with deep symbolic as well as nutritional significance. Figs were eaten fresh in season and dried for storage, providing a concentrated source of energy during the lean winter months. Dates served a similar function, and were also pressed into a thick syrup called date honey, which many scholars believe is the honey referenced in the biblical phrase, a land flowing with milk and honey, rather than bee honey, which was available but less common. Vegetables included onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, and various greens, though the archaeological record for vegetables is sparser than for grains and fruits, because vegetable matter decomposes more quickly and leaves fewer recoverable traces. The seventh and final category, and the one that most surprised modern audiences, was dairy and meat. Contrary to the popular image of biblical feasts groaning with roasted lamb and beef, meat was consumed far less frequently than most people assumed. For the average family, meat was reserved for religious festivals, sacrificial occasions, and celebrations such as weddings. The Passover lamb is the most famous example, but even this was a once-a-year event. On ordinary days, the animal protein in the diet came primarily from dairy products, including fresh and curdled milk from goats and sheep, soft cheeses, and yogurt. Goat's milk was far more common than cow's milk, and the thick, tangy yogurt made from it was a staple that appeared at many meals. As Daniel laid out this research for the production team, he was struck by a realization that he articulated to Maya one afternoon as they sat in his office surrounded by printouts and old photographs from archaeological digs. The diet of the biblical world, he said, was in many ways a Mediterranean diet in its most elemental form. Grains, olive oil, wine, legumes, fish, fruits, and vegetables, with meat as an occasional supplement rather than a daily expectation. It was a diet born of scarcity and shaped by geography, climate, and religious law. But it was also a diet of remarkable nutritional wisdom. The combination of legumes and grains provided complete proteins. The olive oil delivered healthy fats. The fermented foods, including wine, pickled vegetables, and fermented fish sauce, supported gut health in ways that modern nutritional science was only beginning to fully appreciate. The people of the biblical world did not eat this way because they understood the biochemistry. They ate this way because generations of accumulated cultural knowledge had taught them what sustained life in their particular corner of the earth. Maya looked at him when he finished speaking and said something that he would remember for a long time.
that.
She said that
And
what
while
moved her
this
most
theory may
about this
seem
research was not
counterintuitive
the
at
nutritional
first,
data
we
or
see
the
its
archaeological
echo
evidence,
in the historical
but
data.
the image of ordinary people,
The
mothers and
transition from
fathers,
Neolithic food
children
production
and
to complex
grandparents,
Mediterranean
sitting on the
systems
ground
was
around a
driven
low
by
table,
environmental pressures
tearing
and
bread
trade.
with their hands,
You see?
dipping it into a
This
shared
isn't just
bowl
a
of
crust.
lentil stew,
It's a connection,
passing
a
a cup of
bond
watered
reaching
wine
back
from
millennia.
person to person.
Look at it. Perfection.
And doing this not as an
The
event,
importance of
but as
bread.
the unremarkable rhythm of
It
daily
is not
life.
just sustenance.
She said that in a world where
It
so
is
many
history.
people ate alone,
It
in
is
their
a symbol.
cars, at their desks, staring at screens, there was something almost unbearably beautiful about the simplicity of that ancient table. Daniel did
The
not
ingenuity
respond.
of our ancestors
He adjusted his
is truly
glasses and looked down
astounding.
at his notes and pretended
Consider
to
the
read
simple
something
elegance
because
of
he did
this
not trust
tabon
himself to
oven.
speak without his voice breaking, because he was thinking about Catherine and about the dining table in their Brookline apartment that had eventually become just another surface covered with his papers and books, and about all the meals he had missed or eaten in distracted silence while his wife and daughter sat across from him, waiting for him to
I
be
apologize.
present.
Where was I? Right.
Se essa
Quantum
história
entanglement.
está
It is the
fazendo
most
você
beautiful
refletir
deception.
sobre
It is
algo
not
na sua
about
própria
particles
vida,
communicating. It's about
escreva
particles
nos
existing as
comentários.
one.
A mesa mais importante
Here,
é a que a
here,
gente
look at
compartilha.
this.
Eu quero
Wait,
muito saber
is
quantos
this?
de vocês se
I
identificaram com
recognize
essa
this.
mensagem. The experimental cooking
I
phase
understand
of the
why you're
documentary
here.
project began
Let me
in
tell
late
you what I've
March
learned.
at a rented
Tell me.
farmstead property in the rural outskirts of Concord,
The data
Massachusetts.
unequivocally
Jack
supports
Nolan
my
had secured the
hypothesis.
location for 2
Yes,
weeks of
I'm
filming,
starting to see
and
your
the production
point.
team had spent the previous days constructing a rudimentary outdoor kitchen based on archaeological models of first-century Palestinian domestic spaces.
Bread,
The centerpiece was a
olive
taboo,
oil,
a traditional
wine,
clay oven shaped like a
legumes,
truncated cone,
and vegetables.
approximately
That's all there
2.5
was.
feet tall, which Daniel and Maya had built themselves following descriptions from ethnographic studies of traditional
Your argument
bread-baking
here has a
practices still
fundamental
surviving
flaw.
in parts of the modern Middle East. Beside the tabun
Your
stood a
work
flat
is all
stone
here,
surface that would serve as a
but
food
it has to
preparation
connect
area,
with this.
several
It's missing
large clay
heart.
pots for cooking stews, and a small stone mill, a hand-powered rotary quern for grinding grain into flour. The first day of filming was an education in humility. Daniel had spent 30 years studying ancient food production in theory, but the reality of actually doing it was an entirely different experience. The process of grinding barley into flour using the stone quern was physically exhausting, requiring sustained circular motion that made his shoulders burn and his hands ache within minutes. Maya, who was younger and fitter, took over after Daniel's first attempt and managed to produce a small bowl of coarse, uneven flour after nearly 40 minutes of continuous grinding. She looked at the modest result with an expression of disbelief and said that she now understood at a visceral level why bread was considered sacred in the ancient world. When you spent the better part of an hour grinding enough flour for a single family's daily bread, every crumb took on a weight that no modern person who had ever casually tossed a half-eaten sandwich in the trash could fully comprehend. The bread making itself was a revelation. Daniel mixed the coarse barley flour with water and a small amount of salt, kneading it into a dense, slightly sticky dough. There was no yeast in the modern sense. Instead, he used a piece of sourdough starter that he and Maya had cultivated over the previous week from a mixture of flour and water left to ferment naturally, a method that would have been common in the ancient world, where natural leavening was achieved through the wild yeasts present in the environment. For the unleavened bread, the matzah-like flatbread that was the everyday staple, he simply flattened small portions of dough into thin rounds and slapped them against the interior walls of the heated tabun, where they baked in minutes into crisp, slightly charred discs with a nutty, mineral flavor that was utterly unlike anything available in a modern bakery. Luis, the cinematographer, captured every detail in stunning close-up. The grain sliding through the quern, the hands kneading the dough, the bread blistering and browning inside the clay oven, the thin trail of smoke rising into the late March sky. Daniel, who had initially been self-conscious about being filmed, gradually relaxed into the process and began to narrate what he was doing with a natural eloquence that surprised even himself. He explained that the bread they were making was not uniform or symmetrical. It was rough, irregular,
I've got it. I
flecked
know
with
what we need
bran
to do.
and tiny
It's
fragments
perfect.
of stone
it's a
from the
game
quern,
changer. Trust
exactly
me,
as
I
it would have been
swear, it's gonna
2,000
work.
years
Listen
ago.
to this.
He explained
I
that the
truly believe
taban
this is a
oven,
game
heated
changer.
with dried
The market
wood
is
and
ripe for
animal dung,
disruption, and we
produced
have
an
the
intense,
team and
direct
technology
heat
to
that
make
gave
it
the bread a
happen.
distinctive
Are you
smoky
in?
flavor and a texture that was crisp on the outside and dense and chewy within. He explained that this bread, this specific bread, was in all likelihood very close to what a family in Nazareth or Capernaum would have torn apart and shared at their evening meal during the time of Jesus.
Yes, that's it.
The second
It's right
major
here.
experiment
Oh,
was the preparation of a lentil stew, the dish that
Unbelievable.
Daniel believed was
This
the single
changes
most commonly
everything.
consumed cooked food in first-century Palestine. He sorted through a batch of small brown lentils, picking out debris and damaged ones, then simmered them slowly in a clay pot
Hi,
over an
everyone.
open
I'm
wood
Maya.
fire with
See?
water,
And this is Maya,
olive oil,
our new
garlic,
strategist.
cumin,
great to be
and
here.
coriander.
Welcome aboard.
The aroma that rose from the pot as the stew cooked was extraordinary, earthy and rich and deeply savory, filling the outdoor kitchen with a warmth that felt almost ancestral. Maya tasted the stew when it was done and stood still for a moment, processing. She said it was one of the most satisfying things she had ever eaten, not because it was complex or sophisticated, but because it was honest. Every ingredient was there for a reason, and nothing was wasted. And the combination of the cumin and coriander with the creamy lentils and the fruity, peppery olive oil created a harmony that needed nothing more. Daniel found himself moved in ways he had not anticipated. Standing beside the tabboune, watching the bread bake, stirring the lentil stew with a wooden ladle, he felt for the first time that he was not merely studying the past, but touching it. The heat on his face, the grit of the flour under his fingernails, the smell of the smoke and the spices, these sensory experiences closed a gap that 30 years of library research had never been able to bridge. He understood in his body rather than his mind what it had meant to prepare food in the ancient world. The labor, the patience, the intimate connection between the person who cooked and the earth that produced the ingredients. And he understood, perhaps for the first time with real clarity, why meals in the biblical world were never just about eating. They were acts of creation, of community, of gratitude. When you had spent hours grinding grain and tending fire to produce a meal, you did not eat it alone or in haste. You gathered the people you loved around you and you shared it because the food itself was an expression of care
Yes,
that
that makes
required
sense.
no
And this
words.
specific seal, it verifies
Over the
its
following
origin.
days,
Olive oil
the
was
team
not just
worked through a
oil.
series of
It was
additional
currency.
preparations.
It was technology.
They made a fresh goat
And a
cheese by
sacred
curdling milk
substance
with
all at
vinegar
once.
and pressing the curds in a linen cloth, producing a soft, tangy cheese that was mild and creamy. They prepared dried and salted fish, rehydrating it and cooking it over coals until the edges crisped and the flesh flaked apart. They made a simple sauce from fermented fish and salt that approximated the ancient garum, a condiment that was pungent and intensely savory, rich in umami in a way that would have made it an invaluable flavor enhancer in a diet that was otherwise relatively bland. They pressed fresh olive oil from a batch of Kalamata olives using a stone weight, collecting the golden green liquid in a clay bowl. They soaked dried figs and dates in water and mashed them into a thick paste that served as a natural sweetener and a concentrated source of energy. They roasted fresh pomegranates and squeezed the juice into clay cups. And they prepared a simple salad of wild greens, cucumbers, and onions dressed with olive oil and a squeeze of lemon. The kind of fresh accompaniment that would have been common during the spring and summer months when vegetables were in season. Each preparation was filmed meticulously and narrated by Daniel with a depth of knowledge and a growing emotional openness that visibly impressed the production team. Jack Nolan told Daniel during a break between filming sessions that the footage was extraordinary, not because of production values, but because of the genuine feeling that came through. He said that Daniel had a quality that could not be manufactured, the quality of a man who was truly in love with his subject and who, for the first time, was allowing that love to be visible. But amid the productivity and the growing excitement of the project, there was a shadow that Daniel carried with him every day and that he shared with no one. Elise had called him the previous week with the results of her medical tests. The abdominal pain that she had initially attributed to stress had been identified as a complication of Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel condition that would require ongoing treatment and significant dietary changes. She had sounded calm on the phone, almost detached, explaining the diagnosis in clinical terms as though she were talking about someone else's body. Daniel had listened in silence, his hand gripping the phone so tightly that his knuckles turned white. And when she finished, he had asked again if she needed him to come to Chicago. And again, she had said no. But this time, something was different. This time, standing in the outdoor kitchen at the Concord farmstead, surrounded by the smells and textures of food that was designed not to impress but to sustain, Daniel felt the weight of his daughter's diagnosis in a way that he could not intellectualize or compartmentalize. His daughter was sick. Her body was at war with itself over something as fundamental as digestion, as fundamental as eating. And he, the man who knew more about the history of human nourishment than almost anyone alive, had not been nourishing the one person in the world who needed him most. He stood alone by the taboon that evening, after the crew had packed up for the day, and he watched the last embers glow inside the clay oven. And he made a decision. He would go to Chicago. Not next month, not when the filming was done, not when it was convenient. He would go now. Daniel flew to Chicago on a Wednesday morning, carrying a small suitcase and a canvas bag containing a carefully wrapped loaf of the barley bread he had baked in the taboon, a jar of the olive oil they had pressed, a container of the lentil stew, and a small clay bowl filled with the date paste. He did not tell Elise he was coming. He simply took a cab from O'Hare to her apartment in the Logan Square neighborhood, climbed the stairs to the third floor of her walk-up building,
The biblical
and
diet
knocked on the
was
door.
a Mediterranean diet.
When Elise opened the door and
in
saw her
its
father
most
standing there with his
elemental form.
canvas bag and his
Yes.
slightly bewildered expression, she
Grains,
did not say
olive
anything
oil,
for several
wine,
seconds.
legumes,
She was
fish,
thinner than the last
fruits,
time he had
vegetables,
seen her, at
with meat
Thanksgiving
as an
5 months
occasional
earlier,
supplement.
and there were faint shadows under her eyes that told him she had not been sleeping well. She was wearing an oversized university sweatshirt and leggings, and her
Legumes
dark
plus
hair,
grains
inherited from
equals
Catherine,
complete proteins.
was pulled back in a
Olive
messy
oil,
ponytail.
healthy fats.
She looked at
fermented
him, and
foods,
he looked
gut
at
health.
her. And then she
And that's
stepped
the tragedy.
forward and hugged him,
They understood
pressing her face
nutrition in
into
a
his
way we
shoulder in a
forgot.
way she had not
I
done
know,
since she was a
that's why
teenager.
This is so important.
And Daniel felt something inside his chest crack open like dry earth receiving rain. They sat together in her small kitchen, which was bright and cluttered with the artifacts of a young person's life. A bulletin board covered with magazine clippings and postcards, a shelf of cookbooks, a hanging plant that needed watering, a coffee maker with a permanently stained carafe. Daniel unpacked the food from his canvas bag and spread it on the table, and Elise watched with a mixture of curiosity and amusement as he explained what each item was. He told her about the barley bread, about grinding the grain by hand, about the Tabin oven, about the smoky flavor and the dense texture. He told her about the lentil stew and the way the cumin and coriander transformed a handful of humble legumes into something that had sustained millions of people across thousands of years. He told her about the olive oil and the date paste, and about the archaeological discoveries that were reshaping what scholars understood about the diet of the biblical world. Elise listened to all of this with her chin resting on her hand, and when he finished, she said quietly that it was the most he had talked to her about his work in years. Not because he had never mentioned it, she clarified, but because this was the first time he seemed to be talking to her rather than at her. This was the first time his work felt like something he wanted to share with her, rather than something that took him away from her. Daniel absorbed this observation with the discomfort of a man confronting a truth he had long suspected, but never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. He nodded slowly and said that she was right. He said that he had spent most of his career looking backward, studying the way people in the ancient world had gathered around tables and shared food and built communities through the simple act of eating together, and that he had somehow failed to apply any of those lessons to his own life. He said that he was sorry, not in the performative, reflexive way that people often apologize when they sense they are expected to, but in a raw, unguarded way that carried the full weight of everything he wished he had done differently. Elise's eyes grew bright with unshed tears, but she did not cry. She was her mother's daughter in that way, possessing a composure that could withstand considerable emotional pressure before breaking. She told him that she did not need him to be sorry. She needed him to be present. She needed him to be the kind of father who showed up not because something was wrong, but because showing up was what fathers did. She told him that when she had been diagnosed, her first thought had not been about her own health. It had been a fleeting, painful question. Would her father come? And the fact that she had genuinely not known the answer told her everything about the distance that had grown between them. They sat in silence for a while after that, the food untouched on the table between them. Then Elise reached across and tore a piece of the barley bread. She dipped it in the olive oil, brought it to her mouth, and chewed slowly. A look of surprise crossed her face. She said it was good. Not good in the polished restaurant sense, but good in a fundamental way, substantial and earthy and real. She dipped another piece in the lentil stew and ate that too. And then she looked at her father and said that she could almost imagine herself sitting in an ancient courtyard somewhere. sharing this meal with people who had lived and loved and struggled thousands of years before she was born. And for a moment, in that small kitchen in Logan Square, the distance between the past and the present, between a father and his daughter, between knowledge and feeling, collapsed entirely. Daniel stayed in Chicago for 4 days. During that time, he accompanied Elise to a follow-up appointment with her gastroenterologist, a calm and thorough woman named Dr. Anita Sharma, who explained the treatment plan with clarity and reassurance. He cooked for Elise every evening, simple meals that drew on his knowledge of ancient dietary principles, gentle stews, soft-cooked grains, olive oil, cooked vegetables, all foods that were easy on the digestive system and that had nourished human beings for millennia. He did not lecture her about the history of each ingredient, though the temptation was immense. He simply cooked, and they sat together and ate, and they talked about things they had not talked about in years. Elise's job at the publishing house, her apartment, her friends, the novel she was secretly working on in the evenings, her complicated feelings about Catherine's new partner, a physical therapist named Greg, who Elise described as nice but relentlessly cheerful, in a way that sometimes made her want to scream. On his last evening in Chicago, Daniel and Elise sat on the floor of her living room, eating figs and cheese and drinking tea, and he told her something he had never told anyone. He told her that the reason he had devoted his life to studying the food of the ancient world was not purely academic, it was personal. His own father, a quiet and emotionally remote man named Harold Whitfield, who had worked as an insurance adjuster in Hartford, Connecticut, had died of a heart attack when Daniel was 19, on a Tuesday evening in November 1985. They had not spoken in 3 weeks prior to his death, a gap caused by nothing more dramatic than the ordinary drift of a young man's life away from his parents. But what Daniel remembered most vividly about his father, the one image that had stayed with him through decades like a photograph pressed in a book, was a Sunday morning when he was 7 years old. His father had been sitting at the kitchen table eating a piece of toast with butter and strawberry jam, and young Daniel had climbed into his lap, and his father had torn the toast in half and given him the larger piece without saying a word. That was it. That was the entire memory. A man sharing his toast with his son. But it was, Daniel said, the most nourishing moment of his entire childhood, and he had spent his adult life trying to understand why something so small could carry so much meaning. Elise took his hand and held it, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When Daniel left for the airport the next morning, Elise stood on the sidewalk outside her building and waved until his cab turned the corner and disappeared, and Daniel, sitting in the back seat with his empty canvas bag on his lap, cried quietly and without shame for the first time in more years than he could count. When Daniel returned to Boston, he threw himself back into the documentary project with an energy and openness that immediately registered with everyone around him. Something had shifted in him during those 4 days in Chicago, something that was visible in the way he carried himself, in the warmth in his voice, in the way he made eye contact with people instead of looking through them. Maya noticed it first. She told him during their next research session that he seemed different, and when he asked her what she meant, she said that he seemed present, as though he had finally arrived in his own life after being on a long detour. The final phase of filming took place over a single remarkable day in mid-April, when the production team staged a complete recreation of an authentic first-century Palestinian evening meal. They returned to the Concord farmstead, where the tabun and the outdoor kitchen had been maintained during Daniel's absence, and they prepared every element of the meal from scratch using the techniques and recipes they had developed over the preceding weeks. Daniel supervised the preparation with meticulous attention, but he also did something he had never done before in a professional context. He invited people, not just the production team, but a small gathering of individuals who had become important to him over the course of the project.
And while this theory may
Maya,
seem
of course, was
counterintuitive
there.
at first,
Dr.
we see
Sarah
its
Chen,
echo
the
in the historical
archaeobotanist
data.
from Penn who had sent him the Magdala
The
food
transition
analysis,
from Neolithic
had driven
food
up from
production to
Philadelphia.
complex Mediterranean
Two of Daniel's
systems
graduate
was
students
driven by
came,
environmental
along with a
pressures
colleague
and
from the
trade.
theology department
You see?
named Father Thomas
This isn't
Riley,
just a crust.
a
It's
Jesuit
a
priest
connection,
and biblical
a
scholar
bond
who had
reaching
long
back
been interested in the
millennia.
material
Look at it.
culture of the early Christian
Perfection.
communities.
The importance of
And
bread.
most significantly, Daniel
It is
had
not
asked
just
Catherine if she would
sustenance.
come. He had
It is
called her the
history.
previous week,
It
their
is a
first real
symbol.
conversation in over a year, and had explained what the project was and why it mattered to him. And he had said, with a vulnerability that surprised them both, that he
The
would like her to be
ingenuity of
there.
our ancestors is
Catherine
truly
had paused
astounding.
for a long moment, and then
Consider
she had
the
said
simple
yes.
elegance
The meal
of
was
this
laid out on a low
tabon
wooden
oven.
table covered with a rough linen cloth, arranged in the manner that archaeological and textual evidence suggested was typical of a first-century household. There were no chairs. The guests reclined on cushions and mats arranged around the table, as was the custom in the Greco-Roman dining tradition
I apologize.
that had
Where was I?
influenced
Right.
Palestinian
Quantum
Jewish practice
entanglement.
by the
It is
first
the most
century.
beautiful deception.
At the center of
It
the
is not about
table was a
particles
large basket
communicating.
of
It's about
freshly baked
particles
barley
existing
and
as
wheat
one.
bread, still warm from the taboon.
Here.
Surrounding
here,
it
look
were
at
small
this.
clay
Listen.
bowls containing the
Wait,
lentil
is
stew,
this?
the fresh goat
I
cheese,
recognize
the
this.
fermented fish sauce, the olive oil, the date paste,
I
the
understand why
roasted
you're
salted
here.
fish, and a platter of
tell you what
fresh
I've learned.
figs, cucumbers, and
Tell
wild
me.
greens. A clay pitcher of
The
wine
data
diluted with water stood at
unequivocally
one end of the
supports
table,
my
and
hypothesis.
several small clay
Yes,
cups were
I'm
arranged
starting to see
beside
your
it.
point.
Before they began eating, Daniel stood before the gathered group and spoke. The cameras were rolling, but for once he was not conscious of them.
Bread,
He said that what they were
olive
about
oil,
to share was not
wine,
a reenactment or a performance.
legumes, and
It
vegetables.
was, as
That's all
closely
there
as
was.
modern scholarship could determine, an authentic first-century meal, prepared with the same ingredients, the same
Your
methods,
argument here has
and
a
the same
fundamental
spirit
flaw.
that would have characterized a family dinner in a village in
Your
Galilee
work is
2,000
all
years
here.
ago.
But it has
He
to
said that the
connect
food
with
was
this.
simple
It's missing
because
heart.
life was simple and hard and uncertain. And the people who ate this food worked with their hands and lived by the rhythms of the seasons and understood something that modern civilization had largely forgotten, that the act of sharing a meal with other people was one of the most profound expressions of human connection available to us. He paused and looked around the table at the faces gathered there. Maya, bright-eyed and attentive. Sarah Chen, thoughtful and reserved. Father Riley, whose lined face carried the quiet compassion of a man who had spent decades listening to people's confessions and sorrows. His graduate students, young and earnest and slightly nervous. And Catherine, sitting across from him with her hands folded in her lap, watching him with an expression that he could not quite read, but that contained something that might have been recognition. The recognition of a woman seeing, after many years, a version of the man she had once fallen in love with. Daniel said that in the ancient world, the table was sacred. Not because of any ritual or incantation, but because it was the place where people stopped working and came together and acknowledged their dependence on each other and on the earth that fed them. He said that the word companion comes from the Latin companus, meaning with bread, and that to share bread with someone was, in the most literal sense, to become their companion, to enter into a relationship of mutual sustenance and care. He said that this table, this simple collection of bread and lentils and oil and fish and fruit, was a table that had fed humanity for millennia, and that sitting around it, they were participating in a tradition that connected them to every family that had ever gathered in a lamplight room and given thanks for the food before them. Then he sat down, and they ate. The meal lasted nearly 2 hours. The bread was torn by hand and passed from person to person. The lentil stew was shared from a common bowl, each person dipping their bread into it and eating with their fingers, which felt strange and liberating and oddly intimate. The goat cheese was spread on bread and topped with a drizzle of olive oil and a smear of date paste, creating a combination of flavors that was simultaneously ancient and timeless. Creamy, fruity, sweet, and savory, all at once. The salted fish was flaked apart and eaten in small bites, its intense
I've got it.
flavor
I know what we
balanced
need
by the
to do.
mildness
It's
of the bread
perfect. It's
and
a
the freshness of the
game-changer.
cucumbers
Trust
and greens.
me, I swear, it's going to
The
work.
wine,
Listen to this.
thin and slightly tart from
truly believe
dilution,
this is a game
was passed
changer.
around
The
in a
market
shared
is
cup,
ripe for disruption,
each
and
person
we have the
drinking and
team
handing
and
it to the
technology
next.
to make it happen.
What struck
Are you in?
everyone who participated, and what the cameras captured with remarkable clarity, was the effect that the meal had on the quality of the conversation. There was something about eating this way, without individual plates or utensils, sharing from common bowls and tearing from a common loaf, that dissolved the
Yes,
usual
that's
social
it.
barriers
It's right here.
and created a sense of closeness that felt almost ceremonial.
Unbelievable. This changes everything.
People talked freely and listened attentively. They laughed. Father Riley told a story about a meal he had shared with a Bedouin family during a pilgrimage to the Holy Land 30 years earlier, where they
Hi,
had
everyone.
eaten
I'm
flatbread
Maya.
and yogurt under the
this is Maya,
stars,
our new
and he had
strategist.
felt, for
It's
a
great
brief
to
and
be here.
transcendent
Welcome
moment,
aboard.
that the 2,000 years separating him from the biblical world had disappeared entirely. Sarah Chen talked about the Magdala excavation and the thrill of holding a piece of charred bread that a woman had baked in an oven 2 millennia ago. Maya talked about her grandmother in San Antonio, who had made tortillas by hand every morning of her life, and who had always said that food made with your hands carried your love in it. Catherine sat quietly through much of the meal, eating slowly and listening. Near the end, when the conversation had lulled and the last of the bread had been torn, she looked at Daniel and said that she understood now. She said that she understood why this work had consumed him for so many years, and that she was sorry she had not understood it before. She said that what she saw at this table was not an academic exercise. It was a man's attempt to find his way back to something essential, something that the modern world had buried under convenience and speed and isolation. She said that the tragedy was not that Daniel had loved his work too much. The tragedy was that he had not known how to carry that love outside his office and into the life he shared with the people who needed him. Daniel met her eyes and held them, and the look that passed between them was not one of reconciliation or forgiveness, because those things are not granted in a single moment. It was a look of acknowledgement. Two people seeing each other clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, across a table that had been set for this very purpose. The documentary episode, when it was eventually produced and released on Meridian Content's YouTube channel in June 2019, under the title The
golden
Biblical
hue and
World's
viscosity
Diet,
indicate its
what was
purity,
truly
it's
on the
ancient.
table
Yes,
2,000
that makes
years
sense.
ago
And this specific
was an
seal,
unexpected
it verifies
sensation.
its origin.
It
Olive oil
generated
was
over
not just
3
oil.
million views in
It
its
was
first month
currency. It
and
was
sparked a
technology.
wave of interest in ancient
And a
food
sacred
history that
substance
caught
all at
Daniel and the
once.
entire production team off guard. Comments poured in from viewers around the world, people who were fascinated by the historical revelations, people who were moved by the simplicity and beauty of the recreated meal, and, most touchingly, people who said that watching the episode had made them want to put down their phones, turn off their screens, and sit down with their families for a real meal. Daniel received dozens of messages and emails from scholars, food writers, religious leaders, and ordinary people who had been affected by the documentary. Several universities reached out about collaborative research opportunities. A publisher expressed interest in a book, and Dr. Richard Harlow, the department chair who had denied Daniel's original funding request, sent him a brief and somewhat stiff email acknowledging that the documentary had brought positive attention to the department and expressing the hope that they could discuss future research support. But the response that mattered most to Daniel came from Elise. She had watched the documentary alone in her apartment in Chicago on the evening it was released, and she had called her father afterward, and she had been crying. She told him that she had seen him in the documentary in a way she had never seen him before, not as Professor Whitfield, not as the distracted and emotionally distant father she had grown up with, but as a man with a deep and generous heart who had simply gotten lost in the vastness of the past and needed someone to call him back to the present. She told him that the barley bread he had brought to her kitchen, the bread they had torn and shared together on that afternoon in Logan Square, was the best thing she had ever eaten. Not because of how it tasted, but because of what it meant. It meant that her father had finally found his way to her table. Daniel stood in his apartment in Brookline, holding the phone to his ear, looking out the window at the late evening light falling across the rooftops of Boston, and he did not try to hide the tears that rolled down his cheeks. He told Elise that he loved her. He told her that he was going to do better, and he told her that from now on, no matter what, he would always show up. In the months that followed, Daniel's life did not transform into some tidy fairy tale. He and Catherine did not get back together, though they rebuilt a friendship that was warmer and more honest than anything they had shared in the last years of their marriage. Elise's Crohn's disease required ongoing management, and there were difficult days. But Daniel flew to Chicago every 6 weeks to cook for her and sit with her and be the father she had always needed him to be. He continued his research with renewed vigor, but he also began teaching differently, bringing the experiential dimension of his work into the classroom, having students grind grain and bake bread and share meals together as part of the curriculum. Maya Reyes completed her graduate thesis on communal eating practices with Daniel as her advisor, and it was, by all accounts, exceptional. And every Sunday evening, wherever he was, Daniel Whitfield sat down at a table with someone he cared about and shared a meal. The food was always simple: bread, olive oil, lentils, cheese, fruit, wine. The food of the ancient world. The food that had sustained humanity for thousands of years, and that carried within it a truth so fundamental that it should never have been forgotten: that we are not meant to eat alone. that the table is the place where we become fully human, that the act of breaking bread with another person is, and always has been, an act of love. The biblical world's diet, what was truly on the table 2,000 years ago. It turned out that the answer was never really about the food.
The
It was about
biblical
who you
diet
shared it
was
with.
a Mediterranean
If you
diet
watched all the way to the end,
in
it's
its
because you
most
truly enjoyed
elemental
this
form.
story.
Yes.
Leave a comment saying, I watched
Grains,
until the end,
olive oil,
so I can
wine,
get to know
legumes,
you and find out
fish,
who really
fruits,
loves the stories on this
vegetables,
channel.
with meat as an occasional
Did this
supplement.
story touch your heart? Then hit that like button to help the channel grow and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone you'd love to sit down with at a table and
Legumes
break
plus
bread
grains
together.
equals complete
And if you're not
proteins.
subscribed yet,
Olive oil,
subscribe
healthy
now
fats,
and turn on notifications.
fermented foods,
because here
gut
we
health.
tell stories that change the
And
way
that's
you
the
see
tragedy.
life, and you
They
won't want to
understood
miss the next
nutrition in a
one.
way we forgot